Welcome to the School of Love, the place where miracles are normal. Hello and welcome to the School of Love, the place where we learn practical tools based on scientific research and our own experiences towards improving ourselves, living life to its fullest, and contributing to the best of our abilities to the world around us. I'm Dr. Maria Grajdian and I'm Professor of Media Studies and Anthropology at Hiroshima University. In my free time, I am doing my best to guide you in building up a life of contentment, joy, and fulfillment while applying lessons learned in school to overcome the difficulties, challenges, and insecurities of the real world. In today's video, I talk about the animation movie The Grave of the Fireflies, released in 1988 by the reputed Japanese animation director Takahata Isao as his third animation movie and the first to be released with Studio Ghibli. The Grave of the Fireflies is regarded from nowadays perspective as a groundbreaking media product. I start with a brief introduction to Studio Ghibli and subsequently to Takahata Isao, followed by a succinct but profound analysis of The Grave of the Fireflies. By the end of this video, you will have a rather complete, I would say, understanding of Takahata Isao's animation movie, The Grave of the Fireflies, as well as its significance within the larger framework of Japanese, respectively global mass media. Takahata Isao's third major feature, The Grave of the Fireflies, or火垂るの墓in Japanese, released in 1988 with Studio Ghibli, is regarded worldwide as one of the most impressive animation productions of all times, marking simultaneously a decisive stage in the history of universal animation, transcending the overall framework of the war narrative. The premature death of the two siblings at the end of the Pacific War is unbearable and carries the subliminal echoes of a disillusionment process which Takahata has been experiencing since late 1960s. Starting with The Grave of the Fireflies, Takahata approached humans, human nature, life, the world, rather with humor and an ironic and oftentimes self-ironic demeanor, which has replaced the stern seriousness of his previous animation productions. In Jarinkochie and Gauche de Celeste, further elements in Takahata's universe become clear. The dramaturgic vision gains logical depth. The protagonists acquire human credibility, honesty, and warmth. In his quest for the invention of the real in the animated expression, Takahata urges the viewer of The Grave of the Fireflies to watch and witness the decline and unstoppable death of two innocent children exposed to an inevitable fate. While world leaders are concerning themselves with such things as peace, patriotism, or the values of the Enlightenment. However, there is no hope and no salvation through human agents in this movie. The importance of family and of the immediate community has been repeatedly highlighted in sociological and anthropological works, which refer to pre-modern lifestyles as orientation guideposts for the cold late modernity. However, in dealing with such sensitive topics, the animation works of Studio Ghibli would depict the reality of life as an ongoing process of learning rather than delving into nostalgic reproductions of the past, a past which, as such, never existed. In the forthcoming analysis, I shall underline this intrinsic dynamic between the confrontation of the tangible immediacy of existence with the human need for projection in the future, while nurturing memories of the past, invented or not. It is precisely this quest for an immersion into the deep layers of reality beyond what we perceive with the five regular senses that turns specific works released by Studio Ghibli into masterworks of creative energy and lessons in empathy, in a world gradually distancing itself from compassion and authentic vulnerability. And now, first things first, that is, two important disclaimers. The first disclaimer serves to strongly emphasize the fact that this YouTube channel, The School of Love, is not part of my educational and research activities at Hiroshima University. It is nonetheless part of my privilege, joy, and sense of duty to propagate and implement knowledge, information, as well as motivation and inspiration outside the limited framework of academic endeavors. Together, we can build up a better tomorrow for as many of us as possible. The second disclaimer relates to the fact that I am a trained musician and musicologist, not a psychologist, therapist, or counselor. The ideas I am sharing in my videos reflect my deep preoccupation with life, my own life and other people's lives, and express the results of my experience, research, and for better or for worse, my failures. as well as my recovery from those failures, recovery which is still ongoing. The idea expressed in the videos on this channel named The School of Love cannot, may not, and must not replace the consultation with specialists in whichever areas of your life you might have questions or you might struggle with. If you are new to this channel at this point, I would like to ask you to please consider subscribing, sharing, liking, commenting. Thank you very, very much. This helps us not only with that mysterious algorithm which seems to dominate the YouTube galaxy, but also with contributing to the expansion of the community of humans doing their best to impact positively the world and those around them by discovering their authentic selves and living life wholeheartedly. Thanks again. Within the international animation landscape, Studio Ghibli has become, throughout the past almost 4 decades, a symbolic icon of successful Japanese animation, which emerges as a constructive combination of aesthetic ideological visions and consumption-oriented compromises. As the epitome of an impactful cultural enterprise dealing with the production of cultural assets, namely animation works, sometimes also known as anime, the Japanese version of cartoons, Studio Ghibli's productions stand out due to their strong messages embedded in the medium of visual imagery, both aesthetically reflecting the reality and ideologically tackling urgent issues such as environmental pollution, social discrimination, the process of growing up, historical responsibility, the meaning and value of life, or love as a complex emotional paradigm. Since its foundation in 1985, with a stable location in Higashikogane in western Tokyo, Studio Ghibli has turned over the decades into a symbolic institution of the Japanese entertainment industry. The name mostly associated with Studio Ghibli is Miyazaki Hayao, born in 1942, who has collected the most recognition, but he is in fact solely a member of what might be called the Ghibli Quartet, consisting of Miyazaki Hayao, Takahata Isao, Suzuki Toshio, and Hisaishi Jo. The founding quartet included Takahata Isao, Miyazaki Hayao, Suzuki Toshio, and Tokuma Yasuyoshi, with the last two serving as producer and manager respectively. The composer Hisaishi Jo came later to join the Ghibli enterprise after he was discovered by Takahata and Miyazaki when he presented the music proposal for the first official animation movie released by the newly founded Studio Ghibli in 1986, Laputa the Castle in the Sky. Nowadays, one can talk of the Studio Ghibli in terms of an expanding Ghibli corporation, with the Ghibli Museum founded in 2001 and located in Mitaka, Tokyo, which was projected and built under the supervision of Miyazaki Goro, Miyazaki Hayao's eldest son. A real-life replica of Satsuki and Mei's house from the animation movie My Neighbor Totoro, released in 1988, situated on the Expo 2005 site in Nagakute, Aichi Prefecture, which was designed by Miyazaki Goro as well, and a long-expected Ghibli theme park in Aichi Prefecture opened in November 2022. Ghibli, written in fact Gibli, means in Italian hot desert wind, and was supposed to have the effect of a fresh wind reinvigorating the framework of Japanese animation. Studio Ghibli was grounded, as I said, in the year 1985, mainly by the animation directors Takahata Isao and Miyazaki Hayao. Both grounders had already gathered experience in the field of animation and of the Japanese animation industry, which they subsequently employed in developing their own animation production company. Together with the so-called Takahata-Miyazaki combination, 2 more persons have been accompanying the Ghibli enterprise since its beginning and have been contributing to its astonishing success: the producer Suzuki Toshio and the composer Hisaishi Jo. While within this quartet, Miyazaki Hayao has been the one who has gotten most of, if not all, laurels throughout the years, the real engine inside Studio Ghibli, and the one who had initially discovered Miyazaki, who had influenced him decisively, both as an artist and as a human being, and who eventually taught him the value and importance of social responsibility, was, by all means, admittedly, Takahata Isao. A way more profound life experience, inner authority, insight into the human experience, diverse relationships, tireless perseverance, unbreakable assertiveness, goal-oriented persistence, and a very particular type of genius which enabled him to recognize the genius in others are elements which imposed Takahata Isao not only as the older colleague and main catalyst of Miyazaki Hayao, as well as the co-founder of the Ghibli enterprise, but also as the one who, far more than Miyazaki, has been actively witnessing the history of modern animation and cartoons, and tremendously impacted it, both aesthetically and ideologically, while profoundly helped shape it through a huge corpus of animated works. It is true, though, that Takahata Isao is virtually unknown outside of animation circles. Nevertheless, without him and his immense contribution, Studio Ghibli would not be what it is today, and possibly the worldwide animation phenomenon as such. Takahata Isao's films were mostly no particular successes at the box office, but nonetheless discrete artistic masterworks and milestones within the genre of animation. Ideologically, Takahata Isao takes his distance from his younger colleague and friend Miyazaki Hayao. More than Miyazaki, Takahata has grasped very clearly on in his career the fact that audiences in present times do not need epic stories about heroes, dictators, and the wholly new world after their demise, as colorfully represented in The Prince of Sun, Horus' Great Adventure from 1968. In an era full of evidences that the historical situation gets much worse after the demise of that very dictator. Rather, late modern cinema goers are looking for models of individual responsibility, which generates social cohesion, the second important thematic conglomerate in the same The Prince of Sun, Horus' Great Adventure from 1968. And Takahata's works talk about it, about this idea of individual responsibility which generates social cohesion. In a different manner than Miyazaki's characters, mostly epic, archetypical shoujo heroines on the front line who are fighting for universal values, Takahata's characters are either orphans or desperate children, from The Prince of Sun, Horus' Great Adventure until The Grave of the Fireflies from 1988, or quotidian citizens struggling to survive and to find their own ways through life, from Memories Like Raindrops from 1991 until My Neighbors the Yamadas from 1999. A notable exception is in Takahata's vision of social critique by means of artistic expression is his last film, The Tale of Princess Kaguya from 2013, in which an extraordinary destiny is painted with clarity and compassion, while simultaneously transcending historical acuity into present-day uncertainties. Anchored in a clearly defined cultural reality, Takahata's characters are primarily concerned with individual survival in terms of risking one's own self as a very palpable entity. Humanity as an abstract concept is mostly presented as a diluted form of forgotten humanism carried by distant, cool decision makers who, in their quest for absolute and Übermensch-like ideals, ruin the lives of plain humans. In Takahata's conceptualization of the world, there are no fabulous victories or defeats, but solely human destinies, which in their very average substance, sometimes referred to by contemporary sociologists as wasted lives, in the words of Zygmunt Bauman, cannot turn into the main focus of social analysts. In the evening of 21st September 1945, I died. In this manner, the animation movie which marks off the climax of Takahata Isao's disenchantment process begins. The Grave of the Fireflies, or in Japanese, Hotaru no Haka, released in 1988. Carefully avoiding any pro-war or anti-war stance, Takahata moves beyond the topos of collective guilt or collective spirit of sacrifice, and his preoccupation turns mainly towards individual guilt and individual sacrifice, as well as towards the sense of responsibility attached to it. At the end of the Pacific War, two orphan children, 14-year-old Seita and his younger sister, 4-year-old Setsuko, die from malnutrition and social segregation. The Grave of the Fireflies presents their blunt death as an everyday tragedy in the light of individual battles for progress and historical assertiveness. From the beginning, the two children are given no chance of survival, which is strongly and realistically displayed through the abstractedness of the animated medium. This is a world which I could transform into images precisely because I dealt with animation, as Takahata himself put it. On the one hand, there is the representation of war as a dehumanizing force, not a necessary evil as cynical apologists try to describe it. On the other hand, there is the unexhausted attempt to reveal and celebrate the human essence beyond death, in the eternity of acceptance. Personal decisions are at the forefront of historical events, which are not only questioned by individual failures, but lose their legitimacy entirely due to their historical contextualization. In the age of grand identity discourses, mere survival is not guaranteed to the weakest among the citizens, which eventually fundamentally undermines the effect and validity of such legitimation mechanisms. The Grave of the Fireflies is far more than a disenchanting movie, transcending the boundaries of the animation art. It is a tremendous work of art, which reports with almost documentary accuracy on the dehumanization of humans in the age of world wars. The two children are struggling to survive. Seita and his younger sister Setsuko are left on their own device after their mother dies in the brutal bombing of Kobe and while their father serves in the Japanese Navy. However, the two siblings have not heard from him for a long while, so the subtext is that he might have probably died already. At first, they move with a distant relative. Shortly afterwards, the atmosphere is increasingly deteriorating because their aunt considers Seita lazy and ungrateful, and Setsuko spoiled. Seita decides to leave the house of these relatives together with his sister and get along alone. However, as they cannot get enough food from begging and stealing in bombed Japan just after the surrender, the two siblings starve to death. The plot is largely based on the semi-autobiographical eponymous novel by Nosaka Akiyuki, published in 1967, whose own sister starved to death during war. The author, Nosaka Akiyuki, blamed himself for her death and wrote the story as a kind of reconciliation with his own feelings of guilt. Takahata's animated version of The Grave of the Fireflies represents an almost surreally calm, sepia-colored apocalypse that contains strong subliminal messages. The producer Suzuki Toshio had repeatedly underlined the educational value of the original literary works The Grave of the Fireflies in order to advertise for cinema entrance tickets for Takahata's movie. To this purpose, Suzuki allowed the simultaneous release of Miyazaki Hayao's more cheerful, brighter animation movie, My Neighbor Totoro, with Takahata's gloomier, sadder The Grave of the Fireflies, and hoped that the combination of the two movies would bring with it an increased appreciation of both movies by audiences and critics. Throughout the entire movie, the viewer's gaze is constantly, regularly guided towards Setsuko and Seita's ghost-like figures, overflooded by red light reminiscent of the color of the blood, while the two siblings reproachfully, intensively look down at the fellow humans who had abandoned them to such a painful, dreadful death. While they happen in regular time intervals, these interludes occur relatively seldom, so that most viewers do not really perceive them. It is mostly the more self-reflexive viewers who capture the intensive but nevertheless discreet tension of these scenes. Similarly, Takahata charges the movie with subtle feelings of guilt, which correspond to the thought of what would have been if those children had been given some sort of survival chance, no matter how slim. The possibly resulting big difference delivers a huge shock due to its simplicity and candor. The humanist vision of the director moves effectively into the background. He does not share pity or allegations. He limits himself to an almost documentary exactity that challenges prevalent aesthetic standards. The artistic means employed to this avail reminisce of the simplicity of ideological mechanisms when they have lost their historical validation. The firebombs seem ridiculous at first. Thin, straight tongues of fire against the fence and barely swallowing a house. However, Seita does not even try to fight them, instead takes his sister on his back and simply runs away. From the distance, he sees his burnt house. There is no psychological commentary on it, solely the visual statement of the historical fact that houses are bombed during wars and innocent civilians die incessantly as a consequence of those bombings. The conventional explanation that Seita had given up all hope and casually waited for death to come is more appropriate for an adult who understands one's own situation and estimates it realistically to a certain degree, not for a teenager who is obviously overwhelmed by challenges and hardships. To somehow save himself and his own little sister from the chaos of the end of one of the most destructive wars in modern history. The devastating tragedy of the two siblings results from the lack of alternatives and from the increasing bitter, disheartening awareness of the non-existence of these alternatives, despite all hope. The interpretation according to which Seita closes his eyes in front of reality and rejects to acknowledge the severity of their situation by turning away from the grown-ups around him and trying to find solutions on his own is in itself the result of the mature gaze of the I narrator in the original novel, and it does not exist in fact in the juvenile Seita, starved, scared, and deeply distraught, delivered by the animation version. In his young heart, which can neither comprehend nor grasp the real dimensions of the war and the subsequent catastrophes, Seita decides to survive. Still a child and lacking the supervision of a mature view of things, this seems to him the more feasible alternative, instead of trying to come to terms with acquaintances unbearable due to their harsh behavior, which might have, or might have not, made survival indeed possible. To claim that Seita chooses pride over reason is a mistake. In such a young boy who had grown up under difficult circumstances in times of war and deprivation, pride and reason play a minor role, if any at all. Rather, it is the mature I narrator in the original novel, but not in Takahata's animation work, who blames himself for the loss he thinks, from current perspective, that he might have been able to avoid. But in the logical reality of Seita's situation, there was indeed no alternative, if one takes into account Seita's life experience, the socio-economic background, as well as the historical circumstances. Neither Nosaka's novel nor Takahata's animation film are intended as explicit manifestos against war or as direct statements supporting the concept of family as an indestructible unit. If Nosaka's novel appears as a kind of reconciliation with his own conscience and deep-seated feelings of guilt, Takahata's work constitutes the mere portrayal of an inevitable tragedy by means of artistic exploration. It shows two absolutely normal life stories extinguished by the casualties of war. There are no heroes in the first line, no great speeches about human dignity and human rights, no history-challenging events. There are only two orphans who starve to death under the powerless gaze of the audiences, while desperately witnessing the awkward attempts of the elder brother to persuade his younger sister that everything will be all right eventually. The expressive power of the animation art delivers to the whole story a crucial atmosphere of glowing surreality, so that destruction and death seem unbelievably real and still close enough to be emotionally compelling. In the midst of such a relentless tragedy, the animated medium remains an ideological salvation. The aesthetic dimension of the message takes over the mental control and guides the audiences against their own despair and disgust. Seita and Setsuko destroy an entire line of stereotypes promoted by the animation industry. The helpless brother and sister do not achieve a monumental victory against all odds, but instead they are mercilessly crushed by the war machine. The only thing they seem entitled to is the eternal reproachful gaze towards their fellow humans who have been building up Japan throughout the decades to becoming a world superpower. Takahata does not ask such otherwise important questions as to why Japan had been so barbarously bombed or why the war circumstances had developed so poorly. In one powerful gesture of directorial design, war itself as a man-made occurrence is gleefully questioned, as well as its well-planned destruction of human lives and the very fabric of societies as such. The spotlight is slowly reversed from Japan's historical calamity at the end of the Pacific War towards the personal destinies of the two siblings as symbols of a rotten humankind. The animation movie, The Grave of the Fireflies, makes possible a glimpse into the individual perspective on things, life and death included, by bringing into the foreground individual tragedies triggered by war without showcasing war itself as a glamorous, heroic battle among competing ideologies. The beauty of separate scenes and the almost obsessive concern for detail present in The Grave of the Fireflies as well as in other productions of Studio Ghibli mediate a gentle introduction into the ideatic, emotional dimension of the represented structures by means of artistic aesthetic paradigms meant to soften the brutality of the message. While superficially, at first glance, The Grave of the Fireflies might appear as an anti-war movie, a more compassionate gaze metamorphoses it into a sad, ballad-like contemplation on human existence, told from the perspective of children and lacking psychologizing comments so typical for the mature mind. The title itself is a metaphor of life and death. Due to the fact that Japanese nouns do not usually change their form in singular and plural, hotaru, which means in English firefly or fireflies, might mean one firefly or more fireflies. Maybe what is meant is Setsuko's existence, short and intensive, a bright and happy flame. Mature fireflies which emit light have a very short life expectancy, 2 to 3 weeks, and are, generally speaking, regarded as a symbol of volatility consistent with major segments of the Japanese traditional way of observing human life and the universe. Sometimes fireflies take over the function of symbols of human souls, like in Hitodama, literally translated as souls of the dead or false lights, described as floating, flickering fireballs. Lastly, the Japanese title of the animation movie The Grave of the Fireflies does not include the common ideogram for hotaru, which is firefly or fireflies, but it appears as an unusual combination of two ideograms, hi and tareru, which could be translated or interpreted as something fluctuating downwards, swaying towards the ground using the force of gravity, a physical state similar to the inner tension of a drop of water being on the verge to fall down from a leaf. This combination of ideograms suggests the director's intention to depict fireflies as drops of fire, freely, tensionately falling to the ground. Some Japanese fans of animation stated their view of fireflies as drops of fire incessantly falling to the ground by associating it with Senko Hanabi, literally to be understood as sparkles, a sort of wonder candles, little sparkling fireworks made out of drops of fire held down from the bottom. Indeed, not only in Japanese social culture context, but in wider regions of the world, fireworks, more specifically the small ones to be lighted up in the intimacy of one's immediate household, are discrete symbols of the ephemerality of human life, or of life in general. On this background, Senko Hanabi is a particularly powerful metaphor, as one must carry the stick very calmly, otherwise the drop of fire falls to the ground and vanishes. Moreover, it evokes the image of a harmonious family. In Japan, it is part of a family bonding to watch together with one's own family fireworks during summertime, in the same way as watching fireflies is a further family bonding ritual. Thus, the title is a vivid reminder of the deeply intimate connection between Seita and Setsuko, as well as of the absence of their parents. Their isolation and their premature death are already alluded in the title, so that neither ambiguity nor confusion or hope can arise. Ultimately, through the employment of this title, Takahata outlines the artistic project of the contemplation of life as worthwhile precisely due to its brevity and intensity. In contrast to Barefoot Gen, or in Japanese Hadashi no Gen, which was an animation movie released in 1983 under the direction of Mori Masaki, and which was a further animation work which tackled the topic of Pacific War and more specifically the dropping of the atomic bomb over the city of Hiroshima on 6 August 1945, The Grave of the Fireflies carefully avoids any spectacular representation of terrible, inconceivable tragedies and focuses instead on the little dramas of quotidian life. War is absurd. The two siblings cling to each other and love each other dearly. The elder brother fights for his own life and for his younger sister's life. They die. In telling this story, there is no need for great visual effects, as even plain images can express the intense dramatism of emotional representation. Takahata does not question the ambivalence of Japan's historical past. He solely observes the little tragedy of the two siblings in the midst of discursive calamities. Human beings lose their humanity in the chaos of war and destruction, like the relative who expels the two children from her household, and the family as basic cell and vital concept disappears, as the little actors have no survival chance among the big actors deciding over their lives. The ending is so sad and brutal that there is no spare emotional mental space for catharsis or hope. Red-lit echoes pronounce the verdict. The Grave of the Fireflies breaks the tradition with serene, empathic representation of community and family at its core, and offers a brutal, painful insight into the cynical mechanisms of love and war. While the animation movie is neither an anti-war manifesto nor a pro-war revisionist rewriting of history, it employs war as an uncomfortable reminder that quotidian realities we accept as inevitable, and war is one of them, whether we like to acknowledge it or not, have incalculable impacts on innocent victims who cannot protect themselves against it. In spite of having the phenomenon of war as the main catalyst, The Grave of the Fireflies is not about war, but about human beings who happen to live in times of war and about their pains and losses. Family and any functional grown-ups are absent, and it is again in the desperate affection of the two siblings that we find a sense of relief and forgiveness. Beyond being a historical occurrence with apparently clearly defined levels of good and evil, war becomes thus a personal concern, deeply affecting individuals, both those directly involved and those marginally related, in their quest for love, happiness, and existential fulfillment. Ironically, in the brutality of war and the meaningless death of the two siblings, we see, we feel, and detect the strength to believe in the future and to appreciate the little things which we might otherwise take for granted, like food, peace, and human togetherness. From a financial perspective, The Grave of the Fireflies was, like many animation works directed by Takahata Isao, a flop. Even if it was part of a double release in Japanese cinemas, together with Miyazaki Hayao's cheerful family comedy My Neighbor Totoro, The Grave of the Fireflies' bleak and tragic story prevented many parents from watching it with their own children. This 88 minutes long animation movie is indeed devastating. However, at the same time, he unveils the wide aesthetic ideological dimensions of animation as a genre as well as a historical challenge in comparison to Western cultural imperialism, and in particular with US American efforts. In sharp contrast to further animation works such as Akira, which was an animation movie from 1988 directed by Otomo Katsuhiro, Neo Genesis Evangelion, which was a television animation series from 1995 directed by Anno Hideaki, or Death Note, which was an animation series released in 2006 and 2007 under the direction of Inoue Toshiki, to mention only a few examples from among the most popular ones, which define the animation genre as dominated by sex and violence. The Grave of the Fireflies allows the emergence of an aesthetic ideological universe in which love, courage, and honesty still play a very important role, even if they, in themselves, cannot save anyone. In Takahata Isao's vision, animation is not meant to sugarcoat reality. If reality is ugly and hopeless, it is represented as such. It is up to the individual viewer to discover the beautiful lotus flowers of existence in the bitterness and brutality of quotidian existence. This is perhaps the most important message to be extracted from Takahata Isao's animation works. So that would be from me for today. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening to me. And as always, I'm looking forward to welcoming you here very soon again. Love and peace to you all.